Okay, guys. Looks like everybody's starting to get in here, get sat down. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning with a word of prayer. If you would bow with me, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this lovely Sunday morning where we get to wake up and come together and read your word, learn a little bit more about how you work with your people, and help us to see here how you work in our lives as you have with the children of Israel in the past. Be with us as we go through this lesson and help us to find ways that we can put these words that we're reading from your Bible into our lives to be better servants of you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. I see a couple new faces, so we're doing Joshua. We're kind of getting towards the further end of Joshua. We've done a lot of the first half, the major conquest portion. We got started with Joshua. He took over leading Israel after Moses died. He's taken the children of Israel into the land of Canaan, and they've started their conquest. And really, they've wrapped it up at this point. They fought at Jericho, they fought at Ai, they did the whole southern conquest, they've done the whole of the northern conquest, and now here we are. Last week we wrapped up, and it was kind of concluded that the land had peace, finally. Now, we didn't, I don't know if we did, maybe I did. We didn't really talk about what that meant as far as the totality of the conquest, like how much has actually gone through. If you guys remember, we did talk about how they'd created this safety border around the land of Israel. My map's kind of split up here. So Joshua had conquered this northern region, and they have already conquered this region here before they crossed. So they've got this top half bordered with a little upside down L so that they can keep out anybody who wants to try and get into Canaan. On the bottom side, I don't know if y'all can hear me. On the bottom side, they have done the same thing. So Joshua conquered this region right here, and they've already conquered this region before they came into the land of Canaan. So they have these borders very well defended, but the actual interior portion of the land of Canaan, we still haven't gotten complete resolution on that conquest. And at the beginning of chapter 13 here, where we are today, the beginning of chapter 13, the Lord talks to Joshua, and he says, we still have a lot left to do. So we know that here at the end of chapter 12, when it says, or at the end of chapter 11, when it talks about Joshua taking the whole land and the land having peace, that this is not reflective that they have completed and removed all of the inhabitants from Canaan. That is just saying that they have completed the largest portion of this conflict. Okay? When we look at chapter 13 and the Lord comes to him and says, we have so much left to do, let's divvy this up among the inheritance, among the tribes of Israel. That's what we're getting to here. Okay? So we've completed the major removal of the major threats. All of the United Kingdoms, if you will, of the land of Canaan have been snuffed out. And Joshua has completed this task of freeing Israel from the overbearing threat in Canaan. And now they have to remove the remaining inhabitants. And we have to divide the land, okay? Because they still haven't received a plotting, if you will, of their inheritance. They know they're getting something, but they don't know what they're getting, because the only thing that we've received as far as the inheritance that's been given was what Moses plotted out over here on the east side of Jordan, okay? When they've conquered those lands, they drew lots for it, as God commanded them to, and the lots fell to Manasseh, they fell to Gad over here, and Reuben, okay? So we got Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh have already received their inheritance, but everyone else doesn't really know what they're getting yet. So This portion we're covering today is a large section of scriptures, okay? We're not going to go through it as detailed as we have the first 13 chapters, but we are going to go through it in kind of a section-by-section basis. This whole section of the dividing of Israel takes place from chapter 13 to chapter 21, okay? So we're covering a lot of space here. And a lot of this space is just who receives this city from this city to this city to this city, okay? And I could read all those to you, but to me that's like a foreign language, okay? I don't know where these cities are. I don't know where they were in ancient times, but we've had plenty of time as a culture, as Christians. Many people have done studies on this that are well more educated than I am in this, and they've done these nice little maps for us. So that's what we're going to use for most of this to try and help us understand the regions that Israel's inherited. So over here is the northern half of the land of Canaan, and over here is going to be the southern half. So these little regions, I can't tell if you can see the colors very well, but they're also color-coded to try and help you see the general separation of borders. But these behind me are just kind of the general overview of how the land of Canaan was divided up, okay? And you can find plenty of maps like this online. They're all a little bit different, but they're pretty close. They have all of the major points in them, all of the major cities that are listed. But the actual line in the sand borders are a little bit more up for interpretation as how far they had. And a lot of this has to do with the geographical area too, because when we talk here later about some of the inheritance, it includes the plains around this city. So what are the plains around this city? You don't know unless you're over there and you're looking at the plains, okay? So, and how far that goes into the hill country or not into the hill country is kind of up for interpretation for the people that have made these maps. So I say all this to say the map behind me is not the law, okay? It's just kind of a general picture we can use to reference what we're going by here. So here in chapter 13, Joshua's old and advanced in years. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get started, last week when we concluded the conquest, I believe we had a question of how long did this conquest take? Okay, what's the span of time we've covered? And here, another important part in this section, 13 through 21, is when Caleb asks for his allotment that he was promised by God. Okay? When Caleb does this, he tells Joshua how old he is. And he tells Joshua how old he was when they were spies. Okay? Now, we cannot infer from this how old Joshua was. We can guess they were around the same age, but it's not really told to us that they were born on the same year or anything. Okay? But what this does do for us is it provides us a better understanding. I believe last week I kind of gave my best guess. This gives us a better, more detailed understanding of how long the whole conquest took before Joshua began dividing up land. Okay? So here in chapter 14, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to this part for now. Chapter 14, starting in verse 6, is when Caleb's asking for this. Okay? And he talks about it. He goes with Israel. He's 40 years old when they're spies in Kadesh, okay? Now that's 2.5 years after they've left Egypt, okay? So when he's 40, they have 37.5 years remaining in exile after the Lord punishes them, okay? So they do 40 years wandering in the wilderness. That's including the 2.5 they took to get here from Egypt to Sinai to Kadesh. So from Kadesh, the remaining wandering is about 37.5 years. And since Caleb here says that he was 85 at the time he's asking for this, we can assume that the conquest took 7.5 years, okay, up to this point. So when we see in chapter 12, when it's saying, and Joshua fought with them for a long time, at the end of chapter 12 there, it's talking about the northern conquest and how he fought with them for a long time. It kind of puts that in perspective of what that meant. So we thought the southern conquest took about a year, and then the remainder of that, the remaining 6.5 years, would have been the northern conquest and finishing up some of the loose ends that they didn't cover in the southern. Okay, so we've seen about 7.5 years of fighting, and the land had peace after that for a brief amount of time. So we see that the conquest here, based on Caleb's claim, took about 7.5 years. And then Joshua started dividing up the land as they've both conquered it and as they're soon to conquer. So what am I saying by this? Like we talked about, they haven't conquered all the land. They haven't driven everybody out yet. So why are they dividing up the land? Well, it's been promised to them by God, so they're just assuming they're going to get all of this land in the following years when they've driven out the rest of the inhabitants. Okay? In chapter 13, that's what, at the first verses here, now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You're old and advanced in years, and there remains very much land to possess. This land yet remains in all the regions of the Philistines." So he's breaking down everything they've got to do, and he's saying, you're not going to get to finish this. So we got to set in order who's going to do what, and that's why we're moving forward this way. Okay? So Joshua begins to divide up the land of Canaan by drawing lots for the children of Israel. Okay? We see that Judah is the first. Reuben and Manasseh and Gad, they've already gotten theirs. This is broken down for us in chapter 13. Okay? 15 verses 15 through 33. That's Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. They've already received their inheritance, and the writers here are reminding us that has already happened. Okay? They already know that they've got this portion here on the east side of the Jordan River. Okay? Judah is the first one to get a lot drawn. Judah in chapter 15, so 14 covers Caleb's inheritance. Okay? We just talked about that. Caleb inherits Hebron. Okay? And that's in the region that Judah gets for their inheritance. But Caleb has his own separate inheritance within that. Okay? That he would... So when they divvy up this land too, the land of Judah goes to all of Judah. But what does that mean? Because Judah's not just one person, it's a bunch of people, right? So it's up to the elders of that tribe and the leaders of that tribe to divide as they see fit to each of the individuals in that tribe, each of the men who have families and want to raise livestock or farm or whatever their job is. They each get an allotment from the elders of that tribe. So the tribe divvies it out even further into the individuals of that tribe. Okay? But Caleb got his own special inheritance that the elders didn't get to deal with, that Joshua dealt with directly. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why Joshua went to I'm switching these names, I'm sorry. Caleb went to Joshua. Thank you. Caleb went to Joshua for this inheritance. And Joshua divvies it out to him. But it's still within the Judah allotment when Judah draws lots. Okay? In chapter 15 here, starting in verse 1, is the allotment for Judah. Now this allotment covers this general region. Let's see what we got here. The green region here is generally the allotment for Judah, okay? And it's really big for several reasons. One, Judah seems to be a favorite. I don't know if that's God's foresight with just Judah being the most faithful out of all the tribes to come, or if it's they have a larger portion of people. We'll see here in a couple chapters some of the people aren't happy with how much they got or how little they got. So Judah gets this allotment. Like I said, it's drawn by lot, so it's not like Joshua picked his favorite tribe first. Okay, we don't know what exactly drawing lots looks like. As far as were they, did they have dice? Did they have short straws? We don't really know what it looks like. But It's very commonly used, and it's very often divinely influenced. We see in the story of Jonah, when the men are on the boat, right? Jonah is asleep. He can't tell them what's going on. And they all draw lots, and they're like, why did it fall on this guy? Because they had no idea. But the Lord influenced the lot to show what he wanted to be done. So here we have the same thing, where they draw lots for the 9 remaining tribes who have not gotten their inheritance. They're all put in here for the lot. The lot falls to Judah for this first one. And they get a pretty hefty chunk of the land of Canaan here. They get most of the southern region, with some of this left out for Simeon comes in later here. We have chapter 16 and 17. Both cover Joseph's remaining tribes, Ephraim and the other half of Manasseh, okay? So it keeps talking about the half tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh had kind of split at this point, and half of Manasseh has already gotten their inheritance on the east side. And we still have the remaining half of Manasseh to get their inheritance, and Ephraim, okay? In chapter 16 is where we start with this. It goes to chapter 17, verse 18. We see something interesting here too. In chapter 17, verse 3, it talks about how an inheritance was given to 10 daughters who did not have sons. So one of the daughters of Joseph did not have any sons to be able to carry out her inheritance, and to the 10 daughters, Moses made special accommodation. He said, we will give you an inheritance as well. I think this is really interesting because at this time, daughters would not have been included in inheritances typically. Daughters would have received a wedding dowry or something like that when they married off, but after that, they didn't receive any further inheritance from their family. So to see daughters getting an inheritance here in the form of a land plot is very interesting. And in fact, when we see if you go to chapter 14 and you read through the whole thing, it talks about how Caleb asks somebody to go conquer a city for him, to run everybody out of it. And he says, whoever does this, I'm going to give you the city, and you can marry my daughter. And then when he does this, Othniel does this, our first judge, by the way. Othniel drives the men out of the city, and when he marries Caleb's daughter, he says, his daughter, Caleb's daughter, asks for land as part of her dowry for the wedding. Okay, so she wouldn't have received a land inheritance unless she got it for her wedding dowry. So to see here in chapter 17, verse 3, that daughters or women received this inheritance is very special. It's very unique for the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. Chapter 17, 14 through 18, we see some evidence that really reinforcing what we've already learned in the first 13 chapters here, that not all the inhabitants have been driven out, okay? We see in verses 16 that Ephraim's really concerned that some of the inhabitants in their inheritance plot that they have gotten declared, by Joshua, this is where you're going to be living. This is your inheritance. There's still people there that have chariots, okay? And Joshua says, they're not going to be a problem. Do not worry about it. You're going to drive them out. And in verse 18, he's like, you guys, have you been paying attention, right? you haven't got the message yet. They're still not sure if they can take them on by themselves, because at this point, Israel's been going around as a collective whole doing these conquests, and now they're starting to split up tribe by tribe, trying to do their individual conquests. And Joshua has to give them that little bit of reassurance of, you guys got this. It's okay. So we see chapter 17, verse 14 through 18, just confirmation that everything we've seen up to this point is accurate, okay? They haven't driven everyone out completely. They've just kind of thwarted the military complex that was already there when they were coming into Canaan. They've removed the significant threats. They haven't gotten rid of everybody yet. In chapters 18 and 19, we find out that 7 tribes still haven't gotten their allotments. Okay, so we've talked about when the half tribe of Manasseh rolled into Ephraim here. That's 2 tribes that have covered. We've covered Judah and we've covered Ephraim and half of Manasseh, but they don't really talk about Manasseh as its whole tribe, just the half part. Chapters 18 and 19, we still have 7 tribes. They haven't gotten their allotment, and they haven't run anybody out of it yet either. So what are we going to do? Because we haven't run everybody out yet. They all come to Joshua, and they make this camp at Shiloh. And he says, we're going to send out some spies. Sounds familiar, right? So they send out some scouts. They go scout out the land. They try and find some of the most fair ways to describe the land. They tell Joshua, this is here, that's there, just so that they have a better understanding of what it looks like, who needs what, where, right? Because if someone inherits a whole desert, it's not going to do them any good. So they send out these scouts, and then they draw up these allotments of land, and here we go again, drawing lots, okay? And the idea in chapters 18 and 19 is that the 7 tribes that have not gotten their inheritance yet will take it over, okay? That's their job, is to run everybody out of that portion of land. And Joshua really kind of gets onto them in chapter 18, verse 3. He's like, you guys, what are you doing? You're sitting here right in front of your inheritance, but you haven't taken it. So he really tries to send the message home to them that they can't beat around the bush with this. They got to get it done. So they redraw these inheritances in chapters 18 and 19 at Shiloh. We see in chapter 18, starting in verse 11, the inheritance for Benjamin. I think you can see it. Right here in the orange, that's the inheritance for Benjamin, okay, just north of Judah. We have Simeon, chapter 19, verses 1 through 9. Zebulun, verses 10 through 16. Issachar, 17 through 23. Asher, 24 through 31. Naphtali, 32 through 39. And Dan, 40 through 48. Now, I just went over those really fast, okay? And part of that was because so did Joshua, okay? We've gotten to the point where Joshua's getting fed up with Israel kind of beating around the bush, and he's saying, you guys got to take care of it. So he just starts dishing them out left and right, okay? We see some of these allotments are not as big as some of the earlier allotments, but we also see some interesting things here develop. For me, the most interesting part of this allotment that's not just, cities here, here, and here, are the allotments for Dan in chapter 19, verses 40 through 48, okay? We see here that Dan has gotten some allotments already. Right here. Does that area look familiar to anybody? Somebody says something. What? Right over here on the right screen, does this area look familiar? If you've seen any of your maps in the back of your Bible before about not this time period, but the time after, when we're talking about David and Saul. This region right here, that happens to be part of the land of the Philistines. And if we know anything about the Bible, it's that they're still there, okay? When Saul and David are running around, the Philistines haven't been driven out. And that's because Dan failed. Dan didn't do the job right. So Dan already got their allotment. They were supposed to get this portion right here, but they didn't drive everyone out successfully. They got beat, okay? Now, it's not told to us in Scripture whether it was because they were chicken or whether it was because the Lord didn't bless them because of some other reason, okay? I'm going to assume here, since we've already had multiple instances listed specifically, talking about Achan, and other things where we've seen at the Battle of Ai, right? When the children of Israel fail, the Lord makes a point to write it down and say, hey, don't do this in the future. Okay, so we can assume that Dan did not do anything to lose the Lord's favor here, but they were probably just too chicken, okay, to get it done. So Dan gets another allotment. Now, this map doesn't show it very well, but they got another allotment right here. Okay, this little city right here, that's what Dan ended up with. Okay, so they failed to drive out people from their portion. So Joshua gave them a hand-me-down, I guess, if you will, from Naphtali's inheritance. Okay, they were able to drive out the inhabitants of this one city in the northern region of Naphtali, and Joshua gave them that, since they were able to do that instead. And they actually renamed the city Dan, because, I don't know, they like the name Dan. But they failed to drive out the Philistines. That's one of the reasons why when we see the coming books talking about Saul and David fighting the Philistines right here in the middle of the pocket of Gaza, that's why they're still there, because Israel didn't completely drive them out. And we see this listed here, 19 verses 47 specifically is what's talking about that. So Dan fails and gets a re-inherited portion, but everything else here is just divvied out real quickly. We also see briefly that Joshua also got an inheritance. So just like Caleb came to Joshua in chapter 14 to get his inheritance, Joshua kind of takes the last pick, if you will. Now, that could be just because that's when he wanted to choose. It could have been he felt like his responsibility as a leader was not to take the first pick. Kind of looks bad. But however you want to cut it here, Joshua is the last one to get his inheritance here. So we see that after the inheritances for all the tribes except for Levi, which it mentions several times here, why Levi is not getting an inheritance. After all the tribes have gotten their inheritance, Joshua takes his. In chapter 20, we see that they list out the cities of refuge. Now, in the books of the law, they create what's called a city of refuge. City of refuge is, for lack of a better term, penitentiary. It's a city where if you commit a crime and you're afraid that there's going to be some type of retribution against you, you can go there and you're completely safe. Okay? It's like your own prison. You get to pick it though. You don't get sent there. You choose to go there on your own. Okay? I'm not going to repeat that for the live stream. So these cities of refuge, there's 3 on each side of the Jordan River. You can see them listed here in chapter 20. And each one has kind of their poster child of what you're supposed to go there for. Okay? And when you commit a crime, we call it manslaughter today, like you accidentally kill somebody. I don't know if you were picking up a rock with a rope and the rope broke or your hand slipped or something and it fell on somebody and you killed them. Their family might think it was your fault or you tried to do it on purpose and try to kill you, right? So you would go to this city of refuge to make sure that they couldn't kill you. That's the whole point of what these are, okay? You're not going to be safe here if you commit actual murder and the law demands that there is retribution. This is for things that are more accidental and less intentional in nature. It's not like you can just go around murdering people and use this as your base of operation, okay? Cities of refuge are not for that. It's more for accidental crimes, like manslaughter specifically mentioned here in chapter 20. So, cities of refuge are created. 3 on each side of the Jordan River, north, middle, and south in each region. So they've got a pretty good spread of the area they cover. That's probably because if you're running for your life, you don't want to run very far, right? You want to get there as quick as you can. So, chapter 20, they set up the cities of refuge. And then chapter 21, we have the allotment for Levi. Now, I just said that Levi wasn't getting an inheritance, and that's true. Levi did not get regional inheritance. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so we got, if you look at this map here on, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong side. Here, over here, I see 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. See, here's Dan right here. Major cities, okay? We've got 4 major cities in that big region of East Manasseh. So those 4 cities would be like the major hubs of where you're going to do trade and meat and everything. But the whole land itself is usable, okay? This is not just all empty desert. Sure, some of it's not usable for all things. You might not want to farm out there, but it might be a good pasture land, right? So you've got all of this land you can use for, families who've got a herd, go out there in the middle of, make your house out there. You're not going to be living in the city, but you've got an inheritance, you've got a life, you can make stuff to go trade in the city and then come back and do what you got to do, right? So Levi doesn't get any of that type of inheritance. Levi gets cities, and they get land around the cities that they can farm. And these inheritances are all drawn by lot again. Levi gets 48 cities in total, here listed in chapter 21. Here, I think it's 21 all the way, verse 1 all the way down to 42, okay? So they got a lot of cities here. They were given out by lot. They come from each of the tribes' inheritance. Okay, they're not getting more in one and more in the other necessarily. They're pretty spread out, and these are places where the Levites live, and they can have some farms and have a house and stuff like that. But they don't get any cultural inheritance as far as the regions around that land don't belong to them, okay? The responsibility for that land, its safety, its security, that's not theirs, okay? That's whatever tribe that their city is in, okay? So, it was the priest, yes.
Other duties that didn't involve taking care of the land and stuff, so they had some land, but they were priests. They had
other jobs. Yep. That's very correct. So that's why Levi doesn't get an inheritance too. So their inheritance is specifically mentioned as being the ability to be the ones that give sacrifice to God. Okay, they have that as their inheritance. The ability to work in the temple and in the tabernacle of God is their inheritance, okay? So they don't get land like the rest of the children of Israel do. They get, I guess they do kind of, they get a plot in the temple or in the tabernacle. They get the ear of God. That's their inheritance, okay? So they get these cities where they can live and where they can try to sustain themselves, but they don't get anything else. And here in chapter 21, they list the cities, verses 1 through 42. And I mean, they list them. It's just listing, okay? There's not a whole lot of interesting things other than where the cities are and what they're doing. But the cities are given out to Levi here. And in verse 43, after Levi's gotten their inheritance, we have confirmation that the children of Israel have received their promise from God. Okay? So come with me to chapter 21, verse 43. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of their enemies had withstood them. For the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of the good promises of the Lord had made the house of Israel, that he had made to the house of Israel, had failed. All came to pass. Okay, so what does this mean, right? This is kind of like another capstone on the second half of Joshua. We had the first capstone where Joshua did everything the Lord asked. We had the second capstone. God's done everything that he told them that he was going to do. Okay? Now, as far as the time where this allotment's covered, it covers a lot of time. Okay? We see in the inheritance from Judah in chapter 15, there at the end of the chapter, verse 63, it says they don't drive all the Jebusites out of Jerusalem. So we see that this takes place over the course of many years, despite this allotment taking place pretty immediately. Okay? I don't know if I said that right. The Joshua divvies this land out, right? And now they have to go in and conquer it. We don't really cover that portion here in the book of Joshua, really at all. The secondary portion, it's kind of left up to this section here in verse 43 to the end of the chapter, saying that God has done what he said he was going to do, okay? Everything that the children of Israel were promised, they received. And we see this, I think it's very interesting. We see this too, the fact that Dan didn't drive out the inhabitants from their inheritance, they still got something, right? So God made their bad situation still good. He's done everything he could to fulfill his promise to Israel. Even though they've failed on multiple counts here, going through, they failed taking Jerusalem. They failed driving out the Philistines. Okay, and they failed a lot of times, and God still renews his promise to them. What does that say about us, right? Christians. God's made us a promise, and we fail all the time, every day, right? Even if it's not you every day, Christians as a whole, somebody's got to fail every day. It's just statistically impossible not to, really. But we as Christians fail all the time. And we see here in Joshua chapter 21, 3 verses there at the end, that no matter how many times we fail, God's still willing to fulfill his promise. His promises are good. See, it's really the only thing you can count on. If you went through this book and were trying to figure out something you could count on, it's definitely not Israel's military significance, right? Because they failed to take all of these places that God has practically handed to them. So, what can we count on? We can count on God fulfilling his promise, both to the children of Israel and to us. And if we look at these verses here, verses 43 to the end of the chapter, here in chapter 21, we also see that people who want to claim that Israel today, modern Israel, has a claim on the promised land because it's God trying to fulfill his promise that he made to them and Abraham, that he was going to give them the land of Canaan, is just not true, okay? God fulfilled that promise right here. He fulfilled all of it. Okay? So trying to use that as a claim for what we have today just doesn't make any sense. It goes against the Bible because it's saying that God's promise wasn't fulfilled here in verse 43 when it says God's promise was fulfilled. So we can talk about that, but when we're talking about the promises of God here, we don't want to leave any loose ends. And chapter 21 certainly doesn't when it concludes here very definitively. God's promises were filled completely. Okay, they were totally filled. Now, what does this mean moving forward? Okay, because we'll see in chapter 1 of Judges, it kind of picks up in the middle of the book here, of the book of Joshua, chapter 1 of Judges, okay, where it's talking about Judah's conquest of their inheritance, okay. We've already kind of wrapped it up here. Everybody got their inheritance and God completed all of his promises, but when we talk about the remainder of the conflict after Joshua dies, it's still yet to be completed, okay? So while we have this statement here at the end of the chapter that it's done, don't get confused chronologically when we see here in chapter 21 everything's done and we flip over to Judges and we're still not done. It's because Judges kind of picks up in the middle. It doesn't really wait till the end of Joshua to start telling its story about what's happening here. Because we see our first judge, Othniel. Does that name sound familiar? Right? We talked about him a little bit earlier. He's the guy who Caleb, when he offered up anybody who runs the people out of this city gets to marry my daughter. That's him. Okay, so he's very involved in this early portion of Israel founding its the remainder of its conquest, and he's obviously going to be a leader coming forward, not only because of what he does here in Joshua, but what he does in Judges too. Okay, so we see this kind of continuity between the middle section here of Joshua and the start of Judges, but here at the end we're just going to kind of tie up the last little sections that we've got to talk about for what Joshua had to deal with, okay, before we pick up from where Joshua left off. So don't get confused about the continuity here. At the end of 21 here, God fulfills all of his promises. That's the big message we get from all of this whole section here. Chapters 13 to 21 is God fulfills his promises. And he does it in ways that would amaze us, right? Because he gives us more than we wanted. He gives us a way to do it. He gives us a way out if we fail, right? With Dan, okay? So we've got a full picture here of what how God fulfills his promises to his people. So we've completed the conquest portion, again, we've completed the conquest portion of the book of Joshua. So here in chapter 22, all the fighting men that promised they would fight from Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben across the river, they're still over here fighting with the children of Israel. And Joshua says, all right, you guys have fulfilled your promise, right? You guys did what you said you were going to do. You fought with Israel trying to take over Canaan. I personally believe that this happened at the end of the 7.5 years, right after Joshua does the allotment, okay? Because we talked about how this whole period of time could probably cover 30 years' time, as far as from the time Joshua enters the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan, to the time of his death, which is recorded both at the start of Judges and here at the end of the book, is that they haven't, Joshua's not with them for the entire conquest. He's just kind of a supervisor, right? During the portion where each of these tribes are going out to do their thing. We see when they come to him at Shiloh and they haven't finished the conquest, Joshua's made camp at Gilgal, but he's not out with them doing conquest here. So Joshua's more of a leader, not necessarily on the front lines at this point. Okay, so I think that this dismissal in chapter 22 of the fighting men comes after the 7.5 period where Caleb asks for his inheritance. Okay, so we're actually at the end of time. We're out of time. Next week we'll talk about chapter 22. Okay, thank you guys for listening.